You think you know a story about kindness. A woman gives a stranger her last piece of bread. He returns years later, a rich man, and they live happily ever after. It's a nice story. Simple, sweet. But that's not what happened. Not even close. The real story isn't about kindness. It's about secrets. It's about a town built on a lie, and a woman who stood in the middle of it all, holding nothing but a handful of flour and a silence that could break a man's heart. And it all started on an afternoon so quiet you could hear the sun burning the edges of the sky. The loaf had only just come from the oven, if you could even call it that. The brick box Mara Lee used for baking was more smoke than heat, a stubborn old thing held together by wire and the memory of better days. It had limped its way through one more winter, and she knew it wouldn't see another. She'd kneaded the dough at dawn, half asleep, her palms calloused, and her arms thin but strong. She hadn't tasted bread herself in 3 days. Not a single crumb. But the ritual, the simple act of creation, was a comfort. Out here on the prairie, a woman could lose everything and still feel human, so long as she could make something rise from nothing. The air was golden with dry light, the kind of quiet that presses into your ribs like a held breath. The wind scratched at the door like a stray dog begging for scraps. Mara, who had turned 30 that spring, though the face in her cracked mirror told a much older story, set the precious loaf on the window ledge to cool. Its scent was the only wealth she had. That's when she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, dragging through the dirt. Not the sound of heavy work boots, but the weary shuffle of shoes worn through at the sole. She looked up. A man was leaning against her fence post, a place where the wood had gone gray and splintered with age. He was just a shape at first, a silhouette pasted against the bleeding sun. He said nothing. He just stood there. Dust clung to his shoulders like a second skin. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and he hadn't shaved in weeks. But there was no wildness in him, no danger, no demand in his eyes. Just the kind of hollowing silence that hunger carves into a person. The silence of a man who has forgotten how to ask. Mara stepped outside, her apron still dusted with the last of her flour. She met his gaze across the 30 yards of dry earth that separated them. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. Words were a luxury they couldn't afford. Instead, she turned back to the window ledge. She took the warm, perfect loaf, her food for the next 2 days, the only thing of value in her world, and without a moment's hesitation, she tore it in half. Her hands shook, but only slightly. She walked to the fence and held it out to him. He reached out, his own hand trembling, and then he accepted the bread like it was something sacred, something he wasn't sure he was worthy of touching. He held it, as if he expected it to vanish. And when he took that first bite, his eyes closed, just for a second. It was the look of a man trying not to weep in front of a stranger. He finally managed a word, his voice low and cracked from disuse. "Thank you." She only nodded and turned back toward the cabin, not expecting anything more. That was how these things worked. You gave what you could, and the world moved on. Behind her, he ate slowly, savoring each crumb as if it had been made from gold dust and prayer. That was how it began. Later, the folks in town would say she was foolish, too soft, too open. "Gave her last loaf to some drifter," muttered Thelma Grace, the woman who ran the town bakery and hadn't once offered Mara a discount, let alone a kindness. Sheriff Barton happened to be passing by on his mare, just as Mara was returning inside. He was a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of weary disapproval. He watched the stranger at the fence, then turned his gaze to Mara's door and shook his head, his voice loud enough to carry across the yard. "You keep feeding them, Mara Lee, and they'll never leave." Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Inside her small cabin, the air was dim but clean. There was a crooked table, one chair, and a fire that liked to go out before it ever truly warmed the room. She poured herself a cup of water from the bucket and placed her hands around the tin cup just to feel something that wasn't cold. Outside, the man finished the bread, and then he did something she didn't expect. He moved on. He didn't ask for more. He didn't linger. He simply straightened up from the fence post and started walking down the road, away from her, away from the town. He looked back once. Mara saw it from the window, just a brief turn of the head, and maybe, just maybe, she allowed herself to hope that not all things that left were gone for good. She sat by the hearth, listening to the coals pop and hiss. Her belly was hollow, but for the first time in a long time, there was no ache in it. There was only a strange, quiet peace. The wind carried a whisper through the floorboards, something that sounded like a thank you, though no one had spoken. Something that sounded like the beginning of a story. But she was wrong. It wasn't the beginning. It was a fuse being lit. A long, slow-burning fuse that would one day return to this very spot and burn everything to the ground. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, the cruelty started. It always did. She was sweeping the porch, the air crisp and clean, when two boys from the town passed by, kicking a rusty tin can between them. They saw her, pointed, and started giggling. One of them mimed holding out a hand for bread, his face contorted in a mock plea. The other staggered like a drunk, clutching his stomach in fake agony. Children borrowed their cruelty from their parents like toys. Mara didn't scold them. She just kept sweeping, her movements steady and even, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the stranger had disappeared. She never learned his name. But she remembered his eyes, not the color, but the quiet desperation in them, the way he had looked at that bread like it was a miracle. Later that day, she wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and walked into town, a dozen eggs tucked carefully into her basket. The town of Redemption was a place that had forgotten its own name. It was a place of hard ground and harder faces. Thelma Grace, from the bakery, glanced at her with thin-lipped pity. "Heard you had a visitor yesterday," she said, her voice slick with insinuation. "Hope you counted your chickens this morning." Elias Boone, the widower who'd asked to court her last winter and hadn't liked her polite but firm silence, tipped his hat stiffly. He was a big man, built by years of baling hay, but his kindness always felt like it came with a price tag attached. He watched her for a moment, then turned his back to talk to someone else, making it clear she wasn't worth his time. Mara ignored them both. She traded her eggs for a bar of soap and a spool of thread at the general store. Not much, but it was enough. When she returned home, the window ledge was empty, the last of the crumbs gone, taken by the wind or the birds. She thought for a moment about the man. Had he made it to the river? Had he found shelter? Had he eaten since? She baked again the next day, a smaller loaf, made with coarser flour, and she placed it on the ledge again, and the next day, and the day after that, always leaving the window open, always placing the loaf where he might find it. But he never returned. The seasons turned. The golden prairie summer bled into a brittle autumn. Winter came, burying her small cabin in snow that seemed to steal the very warmth from the walls. Her bread became thinner. Her hands grew rougher. Her loneliness became a constant, silent companion. Still, she baked. Still, she remembered. It wasn't romance. It wasn't hope. Not really. It wasn't even charity anymore. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was a ritual of dignity, a promise to herself that she would continue to make something good and share it, even when the world had forgotten her name. Especially then. One freezing afternoon, as a blizzard raged outside, she heard a scratching at her door. Her heart leaped for just a second. Was it him? Had he come back? She pulled the heavy bar and opened the door a crack. It was Elias Boone, his shoulders covered in snow, his face red from the biting wind. "Mara Lee," he said, his voice gruff. "This is no weather for a woman to be alone. My fire is warm. There's stew on the stove." "I'm fine, Elias," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is foolishness," he insisted, trying to push his way in. "You can't keep living like this. People are talking. They say you're losing your mind, leaving bread out for ghosts." What people say is their business, she replied, holding the door steady. My home is my business. His face darkened. I'm just trying to help. Help is a word with teeth, Elias, she said softly, and I've learned to flinch from it. She closed the door on his shocked face, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the sudden silence. That night, something new and ugly began. A rock crashed through her small window, shattering the glass and letting the freezing wind pour in. She spent the night huddled by the fire, a blanket wrapped around her, listening to the storm howl outside and wondering if the one inside was even worse. The next morning, she went to Sheriff Barton. She showed him the rock. She told him about Elias's visit. The sheriff just sighed, polishing his badge with his thumb. Now, Mara, Elias Boone is a good man, a bit persistent maybe, but he wouldn't do something like this. Probably just some kids. You know how they are. It was a heavy rock, Sheriff. It was aimed right at my table. You're making folks nervous, he said, changing the subject. This whole business with the bread, it's not natural. A woman alone. It gives people ideas. It was an act of kindness, she whispered, her voice trembling with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Kindness is a luxury out here, he said, his eyes hard. And you, more than anyone, can't afford it. Go home, Mara. Board up your window, and for God's sake, stop baking for phantoms. She left his office with her shoulders straight, but her heart feeling like a stone in her chest. The town wasn't just gossiping anymore. It was turning on her. They saw her quiet dignity not as strength, but as pride. They saw her solitude not as independence, but as an accusation. That winter, she ran out of flour completely. For 2 weeks she lived on dried beans and melted snow. The hunger was a gnawing beast in her belly. But the worst part was the silence of the oven, the absence of that warm, life-affirming scent. One night, desperation drove her to do something she hadn't done in years. She prayed, not for food, not for warmth, but for a sign that she wasn't completely alone, that her small act of goodness had not just vanished into the uncaring wind. The next morning, something was waiting for her on the porch. It wasn't the stranger. It wasn't Elias. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird resting on the top step, almost hidden by a dusting of new snow. It was no bigger than her thumb, but the detail was exquisite. A tiny sparrow, its head cocked as if listening. She picked it up, her fingers numb with cold. It felt warm, impossibly warm. Where had it come from? Who had left it? It couldn't be him. He was long gone, a ghost on the road. But as she looked at the little bird, a new feeling sparked inside her. Not hope, something stronger. Resolve. Someone was watching. Someone knew. And as she looked out at the vast, empty expanse of white, she realized the story wasn't over. The fuse was still burning, and it was getting closer. 3 years. 3 years is a long time on the prairie. It's long enough for fences to rot, for barns to sag, and for a story to curdle into a legend. The tale of Mara Lee and the bread she gave the stranger had become just another whisper in the wind, a thing that had happened once, that no one had proof of, yet everyone remembered in their own crooked way. Mara was 33 now. In a town like Redemption, that made her a spinster, a curiosity, too old to court, too proud to beg, and too strange for pity. She wore her age like old denim, faded but strong. She kept her homestead standing board by board, nail by nail, as if she were single-handedly holding back the rot of time itself. The town's judgment had hardened from whispers into open scorn. Thelma Grace was the loudest voice at the well. Still living off the wind, is she? She'd mutter, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Heard she turned down Elias Boone again. Poor man's just trying to do right by her. Some women just prefer misery. Elias, for his part, had become a local martyr. He no longer approached Mara directly. Instead, he made a show of his concern. He'd leave baskets of canned peaches on her porch, peaches she never ate, letting them sit there like unopened apologies. His help had become a public performance, designed to highlight her stubbornness and his saintly patience. But behind the performance, something darker was festering. Her chicken coop was raided, not once, but 3 times. Her small vegetable patch was trampled in the night. The rope to her well was found cut one morning, leaving her to haul water from the creek a mile away. Each time she went to Sheriff Barton. Each time, he'd just shake his head. "Mara, it's probably coyotes," he'd say about the chickens. "Maybe a deer," he'd suggest for the garden. "Ropes get old and frayed," he'd conclude about the well. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if her troubles were an inconvenience he didn't have time for. But one day, she saw something else in his eyes, something she hadn't noticed before: fear. She was describing the cut rope, how clean the slice was, when she saw his gaze flicker. It was a quick, almost imperceptible shift, but it was there. He wasn't just dismissing her. He was actively refusing to see. Why? What was he afraid of? The little wooden bird was her only secret. She kept it in a small tin box with her mother's sewing needles. Some nights, she'd take it out and hold it in her palm. It was a tangible link to a moment of grace in a world that had shown her little of it. It was a reminder that someone, somewhere, had seen her. One evening, Elias returned. No basket this time, no soft talk. He just stood on her porch, his large frame blocking the setting sun, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're making life hard on yourself, Mara," he said, his voice a low growl. She was mending a tear in her dress. The needle paused mid-stitch. "No, Elias, I'm just not letting anyone else make it harder." "The town thinks you're crazy," he pressed on. "They think you're cursed, that land of yours. It's going to waste. You need a man to run it. You need me." "I need peace, Elias. That's all." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "Is it because of him?" he sneered. "The drifter. You still waiting for that ghost to come back?" Mara set her sewing down slowly. "You should go." "I could make things easy for you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Or I could make them very, very hard. That fence of yours looks pretty weak. A good storm could take it down. A fire could start so easily in all this dry grass." It wasn't a question. It was a threat. Cold dread washed over her. It was him. It had always been him. The chickens, the garden, the well. He wasn't trying to help her. He was trying to break her. He was trying to drive her off her land so he could have it for himself, all under the guise of being the spurned, good-hearted neighbor. She stood up, her small frame seeming to grow taller. "Get off my property, Elias." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You'll change your mind. They all do, eventually." He turned and walked away, his boots kicking up dust, leaving the echo of his threat hanging in the air. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her chair, the old shotgun her father had left her resting across her lap. She watched the moon-drenched fields, every shadow looking like a threat, every gust of wind sounding like an approaching footstep. The town had abandoned her. The law had failed her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But as the first light of dawn painted the sky, she looked down at the shotgun, then at her calloused hands. She had survived drought, blizzards, and hunger. She had survived loneliness and scorn. She would survive this. She wasn't just a quiet woman who baked bread anymore. She was a fortress. And Elias Boone had just declared war. She spent the next week fortifying her home. She repaired the fence with new wire. She put a heavier bar on her door. She slept with the shotgun by her bed. She was no longer just enduring. She was fighting back. One morning she found a dead raven hanging from her gate post, a clear and hideous warning. The town saw it. They whispered. They looked away. No one offered to help her take it down. She did it herself, her hands steady, her face a mask of grim determination. She knew she couldn't hold out forever. Elias was patient. He had the town on his side. Sooner or later he would win, unless the story changed. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, she saw something on the horizon. A flicker of movement on the road that split the valley. It was too far to make out clearly. It was probably just a farmer heading home late. But it wasn't. It was a carriage. A fine, black-lacquered carriage, pulled by two magnificent chestnut horses, the kind you didn't see in these parts unless someone was dead or richer than God. It moved with a smooth, silent grace that didn't belong on this dusty, forgotten road. The carriage rolled into the town of Redemption just after noon, its wheels whispering over the dirt. The whole town paused to watch. Huck Dolan, who was usually leaning against the barber's post, actually stood up straight. Thelma Grace rushed out of her bakery, wiping flour from her elbows, her face a mixture of awe and suspicion. The carriage door swung open, a step was lowered, and a man stepped out. He wore a slate-gray coat of expensive wool and pale, immaculate gloves. White gloves in this heat, in this dust. He was tall, his face sharp and clean-shaven, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of power, of a world far removed from this one. Sheriff Barton hurried over, extending his hand, his face stretched into an eager, welcoming smile. "Sir," he stammered, "welcome to Redemption. We weren't expecting visitors of your stature." The man in the white gloves took the sheriff's hand politely, his grip firm but brief. "I'm not a visitor," he said, his voice low and smooth, a voice that held no hint of the prairie. "I've come home." Someone in the crowd gasped. "That's him! That's Silas Creed." The name rippled through the onlookers like a shockwave. Silas Creed, the man who had bought half the mines north of Dodge City, the man who owned 2 rail contracts, and was rumored to be building an empire of his own. Mara heard the name from the porch of the general store, where she'd been trading the last of her vegetables. A cold chill went down her spine. Silas Creed. He looked at the sheriff, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. Then his gaze swept over the crowd, passing over Thelma Grace, over Elias Boone, who had puffed up his chest like a man ready to sell land or shake a powerful hand. His eyes scanned the town, not with arrogance but with a strange, measuring silence, as if he was remembering things exactly as they used to be, as if he were looking for something, or someone. Then he turned. His gaze moved past the town square, past the rows of false-fronted buildings, and up the dusty road that led out of town. It settled on a small, tilting cabin on the edge of the prairie. And then his eyes found hers. Across the distance, across the years, across the silence and the scorn, he looked right at her. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, he just looked. And in that moment, Mara Lee knew. The ghost had come back. And he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a reckoning. The world tilted on its axis. For 3 years, she had been the town's silent shame, the crazy woman on the hill. And now, the richest, most powerful man to ever set foot in Redemption was standing in the middle of the square, ignoring the sycophantic sheriff and the gaping townsfolk, and looking directly at her. He started walking. Not toward the hotel, not toward the sheriff's office. He walked right through the crowd, which parted for him like the Red Sea. He walked past Elias Boone, giving him a look so cold and dismissive it was like a physical blow. He walked with a purpose that silenced every whisper. He was coming for her. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't move. She stood her ground on the porch of the general store, her basket of thread and soap clutched in her hand. This wasn't the starving, broken man she had given bread to. This was someone else entirely. A stranger, wearing a familiar face. He stopped a few feet in front of her. The dust from his boots settled on the wooden planks. The whole town was watching, holding its breath. "Mara Lee," he said. His voice was different now, polished and strong, but the name sounded the same, like a memory he had kept safe. "You still bake bread on Sundays?" Her own voice felt trapped in her throat. She had to swallow before she could speak. "Only if the wind stays calm." A flicker of something, a memory, a smile crossed his face. "The wind seems calm today." He gestured toward her small homestead on the hill. I was wondering if you might have a cup of water for a thirsty traveler. The request was so simple, so absurdly normal that it broke the spell. The town let out a collective, confused breath. Sheriff Barton looked baffled. Elias Boone's face was a thundercloud of jealousy and rage. Mara simply nodded. I have water. She turned and started walking home, not looking back to see if he was following. She knew he would be. She could feel his presence behind her like a shield. As they walked, the whispers erupted behind them, a wildfire of speculation and disbelief. When they reached her gate, he paused, his eyes sweeping over the land. He saw the patched-up fence. He saw the sagging roof of the barn. He saw the porch rail, warped by time, the very spot where he had leaned all those years ago. His gaze took in every detail of her long, hard struggle. Then, at last, his eyes found hers again. And in them, she saw it. Beneath the expensive coat and the confident posture, the hunger was still there. Not for food, for something else. She gestured to the bench on her porch. He sat, removing those pristine white gloves with deliberate care. He folded them neatly and placed them beside him, revealing hands that were clean and uncalloused but strong. She went inside and brought out 2 tin cups of water. Not tea, not coffee, just water. The same thing she had offered herself after giving away her only loaf of bread. He took the cup and drank it down in one go, as if it were the finest wine. They sat in silence for a long time. The silence wasn't empty or awkward. It was full of everything that had not been said for 3 long years. Finally he spoke. I made it 3 miles down the road that day, he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Before my legs gave out. I collapsed near a cattle fence. That bread. Mara, that bread was all I had. It carried me longer than my own pride would have. He told her how a rancher had found him, mistaken him for dead, and let him sleep in a barn out of pity. How he'd worked for that rancher for a month, earning enough for a horse and a new pair of boots. How he'd headed west, vowing to make something of himself. I told myself, he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon, that if I ever made something of this life, I would come back. I would find the woman who gave me bread, and I would fix the place where it all began. She wanted to say her home wasn't broken, not really, but that wasn't true. Her hands were sore from years of doing everything alone. Her soul was bruised from the town's relentless scorn. She didn't thank him, she just nodded. Then she stood up and went inside. She returned a moment later with a small cloth-wrapped bundle. She set it on the bench between them and unwrapped it. It was the little carved bird. He stared at it, his composure finally cracking. A look of profound, heart-wrenching sadness crossed his face. My father carved that, he whispered. He made a whole set of them. One for every year of my life. I lost it on the road that night. I thought it was gone forever. I found it by the well, she said softly, the morning after the rope was cut. Silas's head snapped up. His eyes, which had been soft with memory, now turned as hard as flint. The rope was cut? And so she told him. She told him everything. About Elias Boone's threats. About the raided coop, the trampled garden, the dead raven. She told him about Sheriff Barton's dismissals, his refusal to help, the strange fear she saw in his eyes. As she spoke, a terrifying stillness came over Silas Creed. The gentle man who remembered her kindness vanished, replaced by the ruthless tycoon who had conquered the West. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, slowly curled into fists. Elias Boone, he said, the name sounding like a curse. And Sheriff Barton. He stood up, his tall frame radiating a cold, controlled fury. It seems my work here is more extensive than I thought. I didn't just come back to fix a roof, Mara. I came back to tear down a rotten foundation. He picked up the small wooden bird and held it in his palm. This bird is a sparrow. In my family's tradition, it symbolizes watchfulness, unseen protection. His eyes met hers, and the intensity in them stole her breath. My father was a good man. An honest man. This town took everything from him, from us. What was he talking about? What did his family have to do with redemption? Before she could ask, he continued. This isn't just your fight anymore, Mara. It's mine too. They didn't just threaten you. They threatened the memory of the only person who showed me grace when I had nothing. He took a step toward her. I have business to attend to, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She looked at the man before her, the powerful stranger, the hungry boy, the bearer of secrets. She saw the rage in his eyes, but she also saw the echo of the gratitude she remembered so well. She gave a single firm nod. Good, he said. He placed the small bird gently back into her hand. Keep this safe. It's more important than you know. He turned and walked back toward the town, his steps sure and heavy. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. A storm was coming to redemption, and Silas Creed was not the kind of man who made idle threats. That night, for the first time in years, Mara didn't sleep with a shotgun by her bed. She slept with a small wooden bird clutched in her hand, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the world was about to be turned right side up. The town buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Silas Creed didn't rent a room at the hotel. He bought it, the whole building. He didn't just eat at the saloon. He had crates of fine food and wine brought in by wagon. He moved through redemption not like a visitor, but like an occupying force, his wealth a weapon he wielded with quiet, unnerving precision. He ignored Mara completely. For 3 days, he didn't go near her homestead. He didn't send word. It was as if their meeting on the porch had never happened. The town, which had been reeling from their connection, was now confused. See? Thelma Grace announced triumphantly at her bakery. He was just slumming, a rich man's curiosity. He's forgotten all about her. Elias Boone seemed to agree. His swagger returned, broader and more arrogant than ever. He saw Silas's silence as a victory, proof that the powerful man had recognized Mara for what she was, a nobody. Elias even had the audacity to ride by Mara's fence one afternoon, tipping his hat with a mocking grin. Mara said nothing. She trusted the promise in Silas's eyes. She waited, she watched, and she baked. Then, the strange things started to happen. First, the owner of the general store, a man who had always overcharged Mara, suddenly offered her credit. On the house, he'd said, his eyes darting around nervously. Just pay me back when you can. Then, a load of prime firewood was delivered to her yard, neatly stacked, with no note and no explanation. The most shocking thing happened on the 4th day. She returned from the creek to find 2 men on her roof, hammering in new shingles. They were strangers, men she'd never seen before. When she asked who sent them, they just shrugged. Man in the white gloves paid us in Dodge, told us to fix the roof and ask no questions. The town was baffled. This wasn't charity, this was something else, a silent public declaration. Every new shingle on her roof, every log in her woodpile was a message to Elias, a message to the sheriff, a message to all of them. She belongs to me. Touch her again, and you answer to me. The fear in town became palpable. Sheriff Barton, who used to strut through the square like he owned it, now seemed to walk on eggshells. He avoided Silas's gaze, his face pale and sweaty. Elias Boone, however, was not intimidated. He was enraged. His prize was being stolen from him right under his nose. His authority, built on fear and intimidation, was being dismantled. The confrontation happened at the well in the center of the square. Mara was drawing water when Elias strode up to her, his face flushed with anger. "What game are you playing?" he snarled, grabbing her arm. "You think he's going to save you? A man like that? He'll use you and throw you away. You belong here, with me." "Let go of me, Elias," Mara said, her voice dangerously calm. "You'll listen to me." He never finished the sentence. A voice, cold as a winter morning, cut through the air. "I believe the lady asked you to let her go." Silas Creed was standing not 10 feet away. He hadn't raised his voice, but the threat in it was unmistakable. He had taken off his coat and rolled up the sleeves of his pristine white shirt. He no longer looked like a tycoon. He looked like a fighter. Elias, foolishly, held his ground. "This is between me and her. It's town business." "You laid your hands on her," Silas said, taking a slow step forward. "That makes it my business." Elias, in a fit of prideful rage, shoved Mara aside and lunged at Silas. It was a mistake. Silas moved with a speed and ferocity that was shocking. He didn't throw a punch. He simply sidestepped Elias's clumsy charge, grabbed him by the collar and the belt, and with a grunt of effort, lifted the bigger man off his feet and threw him headfirst into the horse trough. The splash and the sputtering echo of Elias's humiliation filled the square with a stunned silence. The town martyr, the man who had terrorized Mara for years, was floundering in muddy water like a drowning rat. Silas didn't even glance at him. He walked over to Mara, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her heart still pounding. He gently brushed a stray piece of straw from her sleeve. "This will not happen again," he said, his voice a quiet vow. Then he turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over their shocked faces, until it landed on Sheriff Barton, who was trying to look invisible near the courthouse steps. "Sheriff," Silas called out, his voice ringing with authority. "It appears Mr. Boone has committed an assault in plain view of half the town. I expect you to do your duty." Barton swallowed hard. He looked from the dripping, furious Elias to the calm, imposing figure of Silas Creed. The power in redemption had shifted, and he knew it. He had no choice. "Elias," the sheriff mumbled, pulling out his handcuffs, "you're under arrest." As the sheriff led a sputtering, defeated Elias Boone to the town's small jail, Silas turned back to Mara. He ignored the gawking crowd. He ignored the whispers. He saw only her. "I have one more piece of business to attend to," he said, his voice low. "A land auction. Tomorrow morning. The old northern ridge plots are for sale." Mara's brow furrowed. That was worthless land. Rocky, dry, impossible to farm. Why would he want it? He seemed to read her mind. "It's not worthless to me," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his folded white gloves. He tapped them against his palm. "Some debts are paid with money, others are paid with memory. Be at the courthouse tomorrow, Mara. You'll want to see this." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the well, the town's silence a testament to the seismic shift that had just occurred. She looked from the jailhouse, where Elias Boone's rage was now contained, to the courthouse, where a final act was about to play out. And she understood. The roof, the firewood, the fight. They were just the prelude. The real reckoning was still to come, and it was all tied to a piece of worthless land and a secret this town had buried long ago. The morning of the auction dawned bright and tense. The entire town gathered in front of the courthouse, not just for the sale of land, but for the spectacle. They knew this was the final act of a drama that had gripped redemption for weeks. Mara stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms folded, a quiet observer. She wore her simple homespun dress, but she stood taller than she had in years. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely calm. Elias Boone was there, released from the jail cell that morning, his face a mask of bruised pride and simmering hatred. He stood with a small group of his cronies, men whose families had run this town for generations. He wasn't just there to bid, he was there to make a final stand. Sheriff Barton stood on the courthouse steps, looking sick. He kept wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers, his eyes darting between Silas and Elias. He looked like a man trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Silas arrived last. He wasn't on horseback. He walked, his boots dusty, his sleeves still rolled up. He carried no air of wealth, only one of grim purpose. He gave Mara a single brief nod, a silent message of reassurance, before turning his attention to the auctioneer. The bidding began for the first 2 plots. They were sold quickly for modest sums to local ranchers. Then, the auctioneer announced the final parcel, Lot 3, he called out. The northern ridge, 160 acres of pasture land. He said it with a slight cough, because everyone knew it was rock and scrub. We'll open the bidding at $100, the auctioneer said. Elias Boone's voice boomed immediately. 200! He shot a defiant glare at Silas. The crowd murmured. 200 was far too much. This was about pride, not property. Silas remained silent, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Do I hear 250? The auctioneer asked. No one spoke. Going once? Going twice? 500, Silas said, his voice calm and even. A gasp went through the crowd. Elias's face turned red. He had been trying to prove a point, and Silas had just dismissed him like a child. 600, Elias shot back, his voice strained. 1,000, Silas replied without blinking. The numbers climbed, each bid from Silas a calm, crushing blow against Elias's frantic pride. The crowd watched in breathless silence as the price for a piece of worthless land skyrocketed. It was no longer an auction, it was a duel. Finally, at $2,000, a sum that could buy one of the best ranches in the valley, Elias faltered. He was out of his depth. He had thrown everything he had at this fight, and it wasn't enough. He looked to his friends, to the sheriff, for support, but they all avoided his gaze. He was alone. Sold! The auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down. To Mr. Silas Creed for $2,000. A wave of relief and disbelief washed over the crowd. It was over. But it wasn't. Silas didn't move to sign the deed. Instead, he turned to face the town, and he began to speak. You all think I just bought a worthless piece of rock, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. But you're wrong. This isn't just land. It's a grave. A confused murmur rippled through the onlookers. Sheriff Barton went pale as a ghost. 20 years ago, Silas continued, his voice dropping, becoming heavier with memory, a family lived on that ridge, a family named Creed. They had a small homestead, a few cattle. They weren't rich, but they were honest. They worked hard, and they made the mistake of finding something. He paused, letting his words sink in. They found a vein of silver, not a big one, but enough to build a better life, enough to make other men greedy. He pointed a finger, not at Elias, but directly at Sheriff Barton. One night, a group of men rode up to that homestead. They were wearing masks, but a boy hiding in the barn recognized their leader. He recognized the star on his chest. They said the land belonged to the railroad, that the Creeds were squatters. It was a lie. They drove the family out with threats and violence, burning their cabin to the ground as they fled. The sheriff started backing away, shaking his head. Lies. These are all lies. That family was my family. Silas's voice boomed, silencing the sheriff. My father, my mother, and my younger sister. They fled into the wilderness with nothing. My mother and sister didn't survive the first winter. My father died a year later, a broken man. And the boy. They all thought the boy had died too. He took a step forward, his eyes boring into Barton. But the boy lived. The boy survived on bitterness and the dream of one day returning. The boy grew up, got strong, got rich, and he never forgot the faces of the men who destroyed his world for a pocketful of silver they were too cowardly to mine themselves. He turned his gaze to Elias. Your father was one of them, wasn't he, Elias? He got a piece of that silver. It's what paid for your fine ranch. Elias was speechless, his face a canvas of dawning horror and guilt. Finally, Silas's gaze returned to Mara. It softened, the hard edges of his anger melting away. The boy nearly starved, he said, his voice now gentle. He wandered for days, lost and alone, until he collapsed at a fence post on the edge of this very town. He was ready to die. And then an angel came out of a small cabin and gave him her last piece of bread. He walked through the silent, stunned crowd until he stood before her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, sealed tin. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in a faded piece of cloth, was a sliver of hard, dry bread. I kept it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. All these years. When I was tempted by greed, when I felt my heart hardening, I would look at this. It reminded me that goodness exists. It reminded me of you. He took her hand, his touch warm and sure. I didn't come back for revenge, Mara. I came back for justice, and I came back for you. The money, the land, it means nothing. If you'll have me, I want to build something here with you. Not a life built on silver and lies, but a life built on kindness and a crust of bread. Tears were streaming down Mara's face. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She simply stepped forward and leaned her head against his chest, the ache of 1,000 lonely nights finally finding its end. Silas wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Over her head, he looked at the disgraced sheriff and the broken Elias. "The deed to that land," he said, his voice ringing with finality, "will be turned over to the federal marshals, along with my testimony. The silver is still there. Let them ask you where it came from." He then led Mara away from the courthouse, away from the wreckage of the town's lies, and started walking up the hill toward her small, waiting cabin. Later that evening, the lanterns on Mara's porch glowed warmly. 2 chairs sat side by side, both filled. A fresh loaf of bread was cooling on the windowsill, its scent wrapping the small home in a perfume of peace and promise. The town of Redemption had been built on a rotten foundation, but on a small hill overlooking it, a man and a woman, bound by a simple act of grace, were laying the first stones of a new world. It was a world where kindness was not a weakness, but the strongest foundation of all. And it had all started with a single loaf of bread, a loaf that had not just saved a life, but redeemed a soul and brought a reckoning home. If you enjoyed this story, a tale of how one small act of kindness can echo through the years and change everything, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think is the true meaning of wealth? Is it the silver in the ground, or the bread given freely from the heart?